Yes, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, the home of old school vintage motocross bikes. And if you're into your classic and vintage off-roaders, and you've certainly tuned in to the right channel to take a look at them. Now, we're currently in the process of uploading all of the video clips and the pictures from this year's 2025 Telford show. And again, thanks to all of the subscribers who have already posted mainly positive feedback on the first couple of videos that we've posted from Telford, but we'll get back to more of those old classics from Telford in just a short while. But until then, we're going to take a short break and take a look at this very nice bike that we came across while I was in Northern Ireland in 2023. So let's dive in and take a look at Dean McBride's 1981 TT500 Yamaha. Okay, so as I just mentioned, this quite nice looking Thumper was a bike that I came across while I was at a charity scramble in Northern Ireland in 2023. So the bike at that time that I took these pictures and video clips belonged to Dean McBride, and I do remember Dean telling me that it's a 1981 model, and although it's not a fully original bike from that year, he did say that the bike had undergone a recent refurbishment, and although Dean never put the bike back to its original stock condition from that year with all of the road-going parts that these bikes had in 1981, but the main reason that he didn't go down that original route was that he was going to race the bike and not use it as a road or trail machine, so the likes of lights, etc. Wouldn't be required. But nevertheless, as you know, these TT500s were fantastic bikes, even when they were still fitted with their original road-going parts like front and rear lights and indicators on the front and rear, and of course a rev counter and speedometer as well. And not only were these old TTs superb road and trail bikes, once you removed all of the road-going bits and pieces, they could still be made into a very highly competitive four-stroke twin-shock racer. Now, as I remember, these TT500 came out, I think it was around 1975, and I think they were manufactured up until about 1989, and they did go through various kinds of upgrades and different kinds of liveries through their time, but the engine in our 1981 was basically the same power plant that powered the Enduro Adventure XT and SR street going bike of that same period. But I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that this TT500 was the last year of the 500s before Yamaha then replaced this engine with the bigger 600 4-valve motors. So let's start by taking a look at some of the bits and pieces on this bike, and we'll start by looking at the bike's chassis, which was a relatively simple, mild steel tubular type of construction that eventually split into two twin tubular rails that ran underneath the engine, which also had this alloy bash plate or guard to protect those precious TT crankcases from any flying stones or other kind of obstacles that would otherwise damage that quite formidable four-stroke engine. Nevertheless, these TT500s did have a dry sump in the engine, which basically meant that no oil was stored in the bottom half of the motor, so the chassis backbone was then used as an oil tank, which was usually filled through this filler here just behind the frame's headstock. So a small oil pump would then take the oil from the frame and pump it around the engine and then back into the chassis, much like the old Rickman frame designs of the 1960s. But in 1981, this big Thumper TT500 was a single overhead cam, two-valve four-stroke that, as I recall, I think had a bore of around 87 millimeters, and I think it was a stroke of about 84 millimeters, which roughly translated to around 499 cc. Now, the top end of the engine was connected by a cam chain from a sprocket on the crankshaft, and to keep the chain with the proper tightness, an external cam chain adjuster is fitted to the rear of the cylinder block, which you can just about see there just above the exhaust pipe. And to supply all of the gas that the big Yamaha engine would need, normally it was a 34mm Mikuni carburetor that was used to feed this thirsty Thumper with what it needed to produce the 27 or so horsepower that they say that this big four-banger produced in stock standard trim. But of course, with some exotic parts like maybe high lift cams and bigger valves and maybe even a big bore race kit, you could turn what is in its stock form a relatively unexciting four-stroke plodder into a full-blown works type fire-breathing ballistic missile, which after all of those upgrades had usually more than enough grunt for your average weekend club rider. And to produce the sparks on our TT500, it was a relatively modern style, well, modern for 1981, I suppose. It was a modern style flywheel magneto type ignition, which was generally reliable and virtually maintenance free. So unless you found that you had to make small adjustments to the ignition timing, then this part of the TT engine was probably best just left alone. However, here on the transmission side, it was a wide ratio 5-speed gearbox, which, as I remember, I think had quite a short throw between the gear shifts. But you have to remember that these TTs were originally made as kind of road and trail bikes, so the gearing was probably made to suit all manner of off-road and road-going scenarios. But you could still fine-tune the bike to your own requirements by simply changing the primary and the rear drive sprockets to bigger or smaller ones as required. And again, the Yamaha's clutch was a multi-plate oil-cooled unit with a selection of steel separator and cork-driven plates, which, as long as you kept the engine in its stock original trim, usually worked well enough. But if you then fitted all of those upgrades that we just mentioned earlier, then it would probably be better to fit stronger clutch springs and plates so that the transmission could handle that extra power. And if you looked just in front of the clutch there, you can also see the TT's engine oil filter access, which is just behind this small cover. And to gain access, it was just a simple case of removing those three little Allen screws to enable you to swap the filter for a brand new one. But generally speaking, this 500cc Yamaha four-stroke engine was pretty much unbreakable, and as long as you changed the oil and the filters regularly, then usually it was trouble-free. But no question, this engine here was perfect as an enduro or scrambles power plant. And just to complete our tour of the TT500 engine, you can see that the exhaust on these TT500s was a big bore header pipe that ran along this right-hand side of the bike onto what was a rear tailpipe silencer. Now, on the original 1981 TT, it would have been a quite substantial rear silencer type of setup that would have been fitted to the stock bike, but as you can see here on Dean's bike, it's a much more simpler tailpipe layout with a baffle inside just to try and dampen down the growl from that big Thumper engine. And although this tail cone here is radically different from the original, it still has quite a decent tone when that big 500 four-stroke engine gets fired up. Now, as we move on to the front end of our TT, these Yamaha forks were, as I said, never intended for use as a full-blown off-road suspension system, because essentially, as I said, the original TTs did more work on the road than they did on the dirt. But having said that, they could still cope if the terrain or the tracks weren't too rough or bumpy. But if your intention was to use the bike for off-road only, then it was probably best to try and fit them with heavier springs, or maybe even thicker fork oil to try and even out the bumps and the jumps, because in their 1981 trim, these forks were just far too soft and spongy to be of any practical use on a scrambles bike. And with only about, I think it was less than 8 inches of travel to work with, you could see that it would be quite a rough ride. Now, also here at the front, I'm pretty sure that the front and the rear hubs on our TT were originally borrowed from Yamaha's highly successful YZ motocrossers of that same period, but you can see that they were just a simple drum and brake shoe design, which I suppose was okay for the lighter two-stroke YZ bikes, but our TT500 was of course much heavier, around, I think it was about 262 pounds dry weight, so it certainly took a lot longer to bring the bike to a stop. But both the front and the rear stoppers did have magnesium backplates just to try and help keep its overall weight down to a decent level. However, moving on to our Yamaha's rear swing arm, which you can see is an alloy box section item, and it's not the tubular steel part that Yamaha originally bolted onto these bikes back in 1981. But swapping the old original steel swing arm for one of these lighter alloy items is quite a common modification on these old TTs, especially if you're going to use them for off-road use only. And although these do look a bit nicer and are naturally lighter than the stock steel items, I've always found that these alloy parts to be a lot softer, and they never seem to be able to take the same kind of punishment as the original steel items, because things like cracks and splits were very common on these alloy swing arms. But on the other hand, back in the good old days of 1981, quite a lot of these TTs were, I think, originally fitted with Kayaba nitrogen oil based rear shocks, as I recall, but I don't think these that Dean's got on his bike are those original factory items, and I was never actually told on the day either just what make, model or specifications these ones were, but they do look quite basic in their construction, and I suppose they would probably work fine as long as the track was flat with no bumps or jumps, although it might be a different story if Dean's a rider that enjoys quite a lot of airtime over the jumps, in which case I actually doubt if these suspension units would even last more than just a couple of laps. Even so, the big TT's gas tank, I think, was made of alloy for 1981, and according to my information, I remember from back in the day, it usually held around just under 2.5 gallons of high octane fuel. Now, as you've already guessed, the paint job and the livery on Dean's Yamaha is not as it was for the 1981 original, but Dean's refurbished the bike and this fuel tank as well to his own style and specifications. So although it looks nothing like the stock 81 road and trail bike tank, it's still been all professionally done, and in my opinion still gives the bike its own personal Yamaha identity. And I suppose much also could be said for the bike seat, which I think for 1981 would probably have been just a simple black type of coloured seat, but Dean appears to have gone for the old YZ two-stroke styled seat with this red and white livery instead of the plain black of the TT500 original. Although the good thing about these Yamaha seats were, as you can see, they had quite a decent amount of padding, and they were certainly long enough to enable the rider to shift his weight from the front of the bike to the back, just to balance it for different weight distribution scenarios. But it all looks good and certainly fits in perfectly with the rest of the bike's overall looks. And once again, the bike's side panels certainly look like the real deal and appear to be the proper plastic items from 1981, which on the original TT500 trail bike would have been this kind of white plastic with black backgrounds, as opposed to these yellow ones here on Dean's machine. But as I mentioned, the owner never really set out to restore the bike back to its 1981 specifications. He wanted to colour it in his own livery so that he could use it as an everyday weekend track bike. And once more, both this front and the rear mudguards on Dean's TT are brand new replacements, because as you've probably guessed, an off-roader of this kind of vintage, which is coming up for I think about 44 years old now, is never going to have its stock factory parts from back in the day still intact. Although Dean still had the time to put his own team logo on the bike, calling it CBR Racing, or Cream Bun Racing if you like. But this rear mudguard is once more a new replacement to the 81 component, and although it's similar in its looks, it's not the proper stock item, because as you'd expect, original replacements are about as rare as hen's teeth to buy or even find for these 1980s TTs. So finally, as we move on to the business end of Dean's Yamaha, we've got a pair of Renthal handlebars there, and all the other add-ons like control cables and levers and grips are all brand new replacements to what would have been the Yamaha originals. But a good addition to the bike's controls are these Acerbis hand guards, which will come in very handy to protect Dean's knuckles from stones or any other kind of debris that gets thrown up from other riders' back wheels. But most of the controls, including this alloy-bodied gasser twist grip, are very good quality items, and it's the job of this throttle gasser to control all of that 27 or so horsepower waiting to be unleashed from the TT500's engine. But just one final piece of the handlebar controls is this engine kill switch here fitted to this left-hand side, which will add that little bit of reassurance should anything happen to that precious 500 four-stroke engine and it needs to be shut down in a hurry. But I must say, original or not, Dean's made a cracking job of refurbishing his old TT, and in its way it's quite typical of what owners do to these vintage twin shockers, because they had quite a good strong tubular steel chassis, and of course that super strong Yamaha 4-banger engine that, although in its stock standard trim wasn't exactly mega powerful, but what that 500 engine did have that made it so suitable as a scrambles or enduro engine was that it had torque in absolute bucket loads. But the icing on this particular Yamaha cake was that as long as you looked after the motor with regards regular oil changes and other kind of maintenance, the old TT or even the XTs were virtually indestructible, and even the most cack-handed or non-mechanically minded rider would have to do something extremely harsh to try and break one of these big Thumper motors, because strength and reliability were two of the best features of the TT and the XT series of Yamaha engines. But I certainly do remember Dean on the track with his TT on the day that I grabbed these pictures, and although the weather at the time wasn't exactly the best because it was wet and slippy, but Dean and his bike still had a good time, and they did put in some decent results over the course of the 2 days. And if you're an owner and rider of one of these Yamaha TTs, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you just how good these bikes were or indeed are, because there's still plenty examples of these Yamahas still doing the business on the tracks up and down the entire length of not only the UK but Europe and beyond. But I'm already looking forward to returning to Northern Ireland this year, because it appears that every time I make the journey there's always something interesting or rare to take a look at. So there you have it. That's a nice looking four-stroke Thumper. That's Dean McBride's 1981 TT500 Yamaha. Of course, not a fully original bike from that year, but nevertheless a quite nice looking four-stroker. So that just about sums this particular video up. So we're going to get back to looking at more of those old classics from Telford 2025 when we return to our next video posting from Classic Dirt Bike TV.